So you can make this DIY plunge saw for almost no money at all. And today I'm going to show you how. And once we've built it, we're going to put it up against this £800 40 volt Makita plunge saw. We're going to put them head to head to find out if you should build one of these for yourself or if you should spend a ton of money on an expensive plunge saw kit. So let's start by building our homemade plunge saw jig. First thing you need is an 18mm piece of plywood like this one. The first thing we need to do is to cut this piece of ply down to the correct width to act as our guide rail. So to do that, flip your circular saw over and we take a measurement of the bottom plate of the circular saw. So in my case, that is 132mm. And then you'll want a couple of square edge tile trims. Any finish will do. I went for chrome. Doesn't really matter as long as it's a nice smooth surface. We'll take a measurement of these and they are 19mm. It'll make more sense when I start to build this, but we're going to be using 2 of these to create our track, so we need to add 19mm times 2, and that brings us in 170mm. So that's the overall width that our track needs to be. Now we've got one good factory edge here, we can use that, but we need to cut 170mm in from that good edge. Now you could use a table saw, you could use a circular saw. Now this cut doesn't need to be millimetre perfect, however we do want to try and get it as straight as possible. So that is the base of our track, and we can now cut that down to whatever length we want. I would advise, as a starting point, if we take some inspiration from the Makita rails, I've got 2 of the 1.5 metre rails, and that's probably a reasonably good place to start, but if you want to cut full sheets, of course, it might be worth making it longer. So now I'm just using my circular saw against the square to cut the length that I need. So we've got a finished base plate size, and now we're going to attach the tile trims to turn this into a guide rail. I lay the trim onto the ply and I make a little mark with a Sharpie where I want to cut it. A mitre block and a hacksaw are the best 2 things to use to cut the trims, although if a grinder's all you've got, go with that. Cut yourself 2 lengths exactly the same. Now we're going to fix the tile trims to the base to give our saw something to run against. We're going to use the holes already supplied in the tile trim. If your tile trim doesn't already have holes in it, you'll need to drill some yourself. Now you're going to want a self-centering drill bit. This is a trend one. You can get lots of cheap ones, but the trend ones are best. I'll put a link down below in the description, as I will with all the handy little tools for this job. So we're going to pilot hole this first. Get your trim flush on the end, and then use your self-centering drill bit just to make a small pilot hole, and I'll use some very short screws to just screw that in place. And now we know that end is flush, we can pivot this and bend it in and out to make sure we get it flush all the way along this edge. And as I manipulate that tile trim in and out, I can just repeat the process of pilot holing and screwing to fix it in place. So we've got our first good edge for our saw to run against, but we need a second one. Now, take the battery out your saw for the next bit, and then I need to remove the blade from the saw. Take the bolt out of the middle, lift the guard out the way, and just pop the blade out. Now pop the guard out the way and you'll be able to lay the saw hard up against the rail that we just positioned, and from there we can now position our second piece of tile trim. Now the reason you do it this way versus just measuring it is because you want to get the right amount of tension so that the saw can slide freely between the 2 tile trims. If you push this too tight, you're going to struggle to move the saw. So just lay it so that it's touching the base plate of the saw, and that gives you nice free movement. And what you can now do is repeat what we did the other side and screw this tile trim in place. We'll use the saw as we go along to give ourselves the perfect tension. Your saw should slide freely. If it doesn't, you need to adjust it because that could cause kickback and become dangerous. Now we need to add some stops in the ends of the rail, otherwise the saw could just carry on going and just cut our rail in half. Take a measurement between the 2 tile trims, which should be that first measurement of 132mm, and cut 2 end pieces from your tile trim at that measurement. And we can use those to create the end stops for the saw so that the saw can't just continue running through the rail. Fix those in place like before. Now we're getting there, but we still don't have a cutting edge. So now we've got the basics of the rail, how are we going to make a good precise cutting edge? So we'll put the saw back in the blade. No we won't, we'll put the blade back in the saw, and then we'll cut ourselves a nice straight cutting edge. So we'll set the depth of the saw blade to a few mil. Make sure you haven't got a battery in when you do this. just so we can make a small cut mark along this piece of timber. Place that in the rail that we've made, and we're going to plunge that saw down in by a couple of mil. Now be very careful at this stage, because when you plunge a circular saw down into a piece of timber, there's a risk of kickback, a risk of that saw bouncing out and coming back towards you. Hold on to the saw nice and tightly and keep well out of the way of the blade. We've got our initial plunge down into the timber now. Hold on tightly with both hands and just run that saw the length of the rail. So you can see we now have a mark that we can work with. So now we need to make some holes for visibility, so we can line up the mark that you make on the material that you're cutting with the cut line on the track saw. And make a mark for the first hole just in front of the guide on the saw, and then you can line everything up perfectly. So we know where the first hole is going to go, and then we'll space the rest of the marks out evenly. I'm going to put a hole every 25 centimeters, but you can have as many or as few as you feel necessary. And now I'm going to use a 38mm hole saw. And now I'm going to use my hole saw to drill through the guide rail to create my visibility holes. Now we'll just give those holes a little sand down just to remove any rough edges. So we've got our visibility holes, and we can now finish the cut line. Now unlock the depth control, and we're going to plunge the saw down into the material. Now again, when you do this, be careful. This is when kickback could happen. And we have plunged through the material. The most dangerous bit is out of the way now, and we can run the saw along that original line that we made. So we've got our homemade plunge saw, track saw, whatever you want to call it saw, and now I think we should test it against my Makita 40 volt plunge saw, which cost me nearly £800. And then we'll have a look at where it can keep up, where its pros and cons are, and if you should bother considering buying a plunge saw or just building one of these. But before we do any of that, if you're not subscribed already, hit the subscribe button, because you don't want to miss out on more videos like these, and hit the like button, because that helps this video reach and help more people like you on YouTube. Now for me, a track saw is the tool that I go to if I'm looking for a precise straight cut on something like this melamine board, for example. And when cutting something like this, I'd be looking for no chipping or tear out on the surface of the board. So I think the first test we're going to do is rip down a small section of this shelf here to see if our DIY plunge saw can keep up with the Makita. So I want to rip 30mm off the edge of this shelf here. Now I'm not going to clamp any of this down. I'm just going to lay my guide rail on the marks, and the plunge saw rail's got these rubber grippy strips on the bottom so that it doesn't slide around, so we don't really need to clamp it. Now we're outdoors, but I'll run the extractor anyway, because that gives us a good comparison of the amount of dust that each machine kicks out. And let's make a cut. Right, now as you'd probably expect, it's really easy to make a straight cut like that with this saw, and it goes through it like butter. Granted, I do have a fairly new blade in here, but nonetheless it's completely effortless. You can see we've got the perfect cut there. It's perfectly straight and there's no chipping on the surface at all, and that's probably no surprise. You probably wouldn't expect anything else than a perfect cut. So now I think we'll test the DIY plunge saw and see what sort of results we get with that. So I'll line the track up with the marks I just made, and let's see if we can get a similar standard of cut to the one that the Makita gave us. You can see how well the visibility holes work in assisting us to get that perfectly straight cut. You can also see that we're getting a lot more dust even with the extractor running. The only real negative I found with the DIY plunge saw rail is that it slips around on shiny surfaces. So I got some of this grippy tape. I put 3 strips on the bottom of the track, and that really seems to help stop the track from sliding around on the shiny surface. So it certainly kicks out a lot more dust than our track saw. But let's have a look at what kind of quality of cut we've got on the edge of the board and how straight it is. So for the most part, this is really good. We do have a couple of tiny bits of chipping on there, but nothing too major. And it's worth remembering some of that chipping could be down to the blade. But what we do have, you probably can't see that, is a perfectly straight cut. Now, of course, this has its limitations. It can't cut angles like this can. It doesn't have the dust extraction that this has. But what it does do is it delivers 70% of what this can do, which is a perfectly straight cut, without spending a huge amount of money on a fancy plunge saw kit. So what I suggest you do is build one of these yourself, try it out, and if you love it and use it loads, then you can go and buy one of these. So I hope you've enjoyed the video and found it helpful. If you have, hit one of these because you're bound to like them as well, and I'll see you guys in the next one.